Okay, you want people to really get caught up in in combat. You want them to really pay attention. You want them to be invested. You want them to be, clenching, on the edge of their seat, just focused on what's in front of them in the moment. Then make character death a real possibility in your games. This is a kind of a tricky one to talk about because it really comes down to a stylistic thing. And I'm going to attempt to explain, at least from my point of view, why there's any controversy at all about character death. Um, I had the privilege of playing through many editions of the game. I had the privilege of starting when I was really young and playing in first edition Dungeons and Dragons. And, back then, there was just a different kind of ethos to the game. It was very built around dungeon crawling, first edition in particular. And sort of the idea behind adventuring was that it was dangerous, that it was foolish. You were a greedy adventurer going into a dungeon to find treasure and to find magic. And it was pretty much a given that it was a bad idea because there were horrible things down there that could eat you alive, that could kill you very quickly if not instantly. There were traps that could just brutalize you. There were all kinds of ways to make bad decisions and get yourself killed. And character death was not some huge taboo. It was just something that happened any given Saturday night. And you made a new character. And you didn't really start to get vested in your characters until you started to get around seventh or eighth level because it was like, wait a minute, I've got something here. Like I can take hits. I'm figuring this out. Like I've actually got one that's alive. I'm surviving. I'm an accomplished adventurer. And so you might play three or four or more characters before you finally got one up to the mid levels. And it was kind of a different vibe. As second edition D&D came on, and especially third edition, there was this real push towards narrative D&D, like telling this kind of big overarching story, as opposed to these very episodic dungeon crawls, with their own stories behind them, but more episodic. As opposed to that, there was this idea about narrative, about telling a grand story with your characters, with your campaign. Player characters. Players were really encouraged to put a lot more thought into their characters, to develop their backgrounds. Character building became way more complicated. There was just way more involved in character building. In first edition, you could roll up a character in, I don't know, 15 minutes if you weren't being picky, maybe even quicker. And by the time we got to third edition, you could have, eight different books open and basically go on a research marathon. You could spend 4 or 5 hours building a character, not really be sure if you're settled on anything yet, and you haven't even touched your background yet. And people are coming to the table with 2 or 3 page background stories, and like players would invest hours and hours into building their characters by the time we got to late second edition and third edition. And so at that, with this kind of idea about narrative, like we want to tell this grand story, you, as a dungeon master, you felt more and more pressure not to kill your characters, not to kill off your player characters. Not just for them, although that's a huge thing. When somebody spends 8 hours building their first level character and they've got this like 5 page backstory about how they're the heir to the elven throne, but they don't know it yet, and they've got this fated destiny, like you kind of feel bad, like having a hellhound like bite their head off in the first, like it feels like a dick move. And even though that was just par for the course back in first edition and basic. And but yeah, not just for the player, but for you as a DM, because we dungeon masters back in those editions in second and third, we started building these epic stories with the characters' backstories interwoven into them. And it started to become a problem for us if one of the characters died. Number one, it might ruin an entire session. Number two, it might force us to rework a bunch of stuff in our campaign that we had planned for that character. And so, in a very naturalistic kind of evolution, in the game of Dungeons and Dragons, it became more and more inconvenient, and then more and more controversial, and just more and more overall difficult to kill a player character, especially at certain tables. And this is where it's very stylistic for you. Um, you as a dungeon master might be very against killing your player characters, and for different reasons, and it's totally valid if that's the way you want to run your campaigns. But what I want to say here is that your players know. Your players will figure out pretty quickly if that is your viewpoint, and they will internalize that, and they will be a lot more bored, and they will have a lot more lackadaisical attitude during combats. Your villain will show up at the start of a battle and begin to deliver his evil monologue, and they will snicker and they'll jest back, and it's all just par for the course. You're already defeated. They will internalize the attitude that they have plot armor. They'll figure out they have plot armor if you give it to them, and you will not have the same kind of edge of your seat, thrilling showdowns that you would otherwise have in a game where the players feel like, yeah, like if we misstep, if we misjudge things, if we pick the wrong fight at the wrong time, one of us might not make it home, guys. It's just two different play styles. And the play style in which character death is a reality is the play style in which combats are thrilling. Um, just my opinion.